Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story. Hey everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Today we're going to talk about Elizabeth O'Neill. Elizabeth O'Neill, known to many in Dublin as Honor Bright, was born in 1900 in County Carlow. She grew up in a Catholic family, one of 7 children. Her father, John, worked in printing, while her mother, also named Elizabeth, ran the home. By the time of the 1911 census, Lizzie was listed as a schoolgirl, able to speak both Irish and English, which was quite common at the time actually. She was the second eldest of her 7 siblings, with 3 brothers and 3 sisters. In 1918, she left Carlow and she moved to Dublin. Like so many young people at the time, she came to the city to try and make a living, basically. Her first jobs were straightforward and respectable. She worked as a sales assistant in a drapery store on Camden Street, one of the busy commercial areas of the city. For accommodation, she lived in Dublin's many lodging houses, sharing rooms with other young women who were also working just to get by. Now, around 1920, when Lizzie would have been 20 years of age, she gave birth to a son, Kevin Barry O'Neill. Now, there's no record of the father, and Lizzie was unmarried. And having a child outside of marriage back then was extremely difficult, especially in Ireland. But she managed to arrange care for him, so he was looked after while she continued to try and support both herself and her newborn baby. By the mid-1920s, Lizzie was living in Newmarket in Dublin's Liberties area. She was about to turn 25 when she died in June of 1925. Life had not been easy for her. While she had done shop work, she had also been involved in sex work in the city. For women in her position, this was a way to survive, though it came with obviously a stigma and left her very much open to danger. Among her friends and in the lodging houses where she stayed, Lizzie became known by that nickname Honor Bright. It was a phrase used in slang at the time, meaning on my honour. But she made it her own and used it as a working name, basically. It stuck. And by 1925, many people knew her more by that name than by Elizabeth O'Neill. Descriptions of her from those who knew her and from reports after her death paint a picture of a young woman who took pride in how she presented herself. She was described as attractive with her chestnut brown hair, and she liked to dress neatly. One of her regular outfits was a grey tweed suit, a silk blouse, patent leather shoes and stockings. She also had a small scar across the bridge of her nose, something noted during her inquest. Lizzie's social circle in Dublin was a mix of women in similar circumstances, often living together in lodging houses and working where they could. One of her closest friends was Madge Bridie Hopkins, who shared rooms with her. These friendships were important as they offered some support in, I suppose, what you could really call a very difficult life otherwise. Despite the challenges she faced, Lizzie was remembered as lively, sociable, and she was quick-witted. She could hold her own in conversation and was well liked by those who knew her personally. What stood out to many was her resilience. She kept going in a society that was harsh on women in her position. When her life was cut short in 1925, Lizzie left behind her young son, who was only 5 years old at the time. It's clear from the records that, whatever her circumstances, she tried to make a life for herself and her little boy. Today her story is marked by a plaque on Ticknock Road outside Dublin, not far from where her body was found. It simply reads, Honor Bright, 9th of June 1925, rest in peace. So, I'm going to tell you Honor's story now and why that plaque ever came to be. So, on the evening of Monday, the 8th of June 1925, Lizzie O'Neill, or Honor, left her lodging house in Newmarket in Dublin's Liberties to go out drinking. She was just 2 days away from her 25th birthday. That night, she was seen in the company of two men, a doctor and a Dublin Metropolitan Police Constable. Both were known locally and both occupied obviously respectable positions in society. For Lizzie, sharing a drink with men like this was not unusual, to be honest. She often moved between circles where lines of class and respectability were blurred once the alcohol was flowing. The group were spotted in several licensed premises around the city. Accounts gathered later described Lizzie as being in poor condition really as the evening wore on. She'd been drinking heavily, and by the time she left town, she was unsteady on her feet. Witnesses said she was pale and needed help to walk. Despite her state, she did not part ways with the men. The three of them left together in a car, heading out of Dublin. Their route took them south towards Dundrum and onto the hills beyond. In the 1920s, this was a much quieter landscape than it is today. Narrow country roads, fields on either side, and stretches of dark with no street lamps once you pass beyond the suburbs. Later testimony suggested that Lizzie was either silent and slumped in the car or at times raising her voice. Accounts differ, and the exact details of what happened during that journey remain unclear. What is certain is that she was vulnerable, far from home, and in no position to look after herself. At some stage that night, she was taken to Ticknock Road, an isolated spot near Dundrum, and she was shot once in the chest. The bullet entered directly through her heart. Whoever fired the gun killed her instantly. Her body was then left in a roadside ditch. The act was carried out under the cover of darkness in a place where it was unlikely she would be discovered until daylight. Meanwhile, back in the Liberties, it was beginning to be noticed that she hadn't returned home. Now, lodging houses were used to irregular hours, but it was unlike Lizzie not to return at all. Her friend and roommate, Madge Bridie Hopkins, knew something was wrong. When Gardaí arrived the next day to speak to her, she had already feared the worst, especially in their line of work, I suppose. You would be worried about who she had been with the previous night. The decision Lizzie had made that night to go with the two men once she had been drinking was one that left her with little control over what followed. In 1925 Dublin, the presence of a doctor and a police constable might have been assumed to offer a degree of safety. Instead, her night, it ended in violence on a country road. By the time the city woke the next morning, Elizabeth O'Neill was already dead. She had left her lodging house alive and full of plans for the evening. Within hours, she was a murder victim whose name would be carried across the front pages of Ireland's newspapers. The last night of her life, pieced together from witness accounts, showed a young woman out in the city, drinking with men of standing, and then being taken from the busy streets of Dublin into the quiet roads on its southern edge. What happened inside that car on the way to Ticknock would never be fully revealed, but the outcome, it was undeniable. Lizzie O'Neill, or Honor Bright, was killed by a single gunshot and left by the roadside before dawn. Just after 7 a.m. on Tuesday, the 9th of June 1925, a timber carter named Pat Riley was making his way to work from Dundrum towards Ticknock. He was leading his horses along a quiet country road when he noticed something lying in the ditch. At first glance, it looked like just a bundle of clothing, but as he drew closer, he realised it was a woman. She was motionless, her clothes were all disordered, and her body was partially on its side. Riley immediately raised the alarm. He went to the nearby Civic Guard barracks in Dundrum to report what he'd found. Guards quickly attended the scene and confirmed that the young woman was dead. She was removed to the mortuary for examination. The location where she was found, as I said, was very isolated in 1925. Ticknock Road was a country lane, bordered by fields and hedges. There were no houses nearby, no street lamps, and little chance of anyone passing during the night. It was the perfect place to murder, if they murdered her there, and definitely the perfect place to dump her body. Whoever left her there had chosen a spot where she would not be discovered until morning. It was practically guaranteed. At the mortuary, her identity became clear almost at once. She was dressed in a grey tweed suit, a silk blouse, stockings and black patent leather shoes, which everybody knew was what Honor wore. This was also the same outfit her friends had seen her wearing when she left her lodgings in Newmarket the previous evening. There was another detail that helped confirm who she was as well. That scar across the bridge of her nose. An old mark that those who knew her recognised immediately. When the coroner's office recorded this feature at the inquest, it matched the description given by her friends. Gardaí visited her lodging house in Newmarket in the Liberties and spoke to her roommate and friend, Bridie Hopkins. Hopkins had seen Lizzie the previous night before she went out drinking. When officers described the body's clothing and mentioned the scar, she confirmed that it could only be Honor Bright. The post-mortem established the cause of death, a gunshot wound to the chest directly through her heart. The reports described it as a single fatal shot. The finding left no doubt this was not an accident or misadventure. She had been killed deliberately. The body itself gave little other evidence. There was no signs that her clothes had been violently torn away, nor did the coroner find defensive wounds on her hands. But her condition and the fact she had been left on the roadside spoke volumes about the callousness of the act. News of the discovery reached the press almost immediately. By that afternoon, Dublin newspapers were reporting that a woman had been found shot dead at Ticknock. Within a day, they were naming her as Honor Bright. Instead of focusing on the brutal fact that she had been murdered, much of the coverage leaned heavily on her reputation. Papers described her as a prostitute, a notorious figure, or a fallen woman. The detail that she was 24 years old, 2 days shy of her 25th birthday, and the mother of a small boy barely registered in the headlines. Back in her home county of Carlow, her family were informed. Her parents learned of her death not from the Gardaí arriving at the door, but from the national newspapers. The scandalised tone of the coverage added another layer of pain. Their daughter was not just simply being reported as a victim of a gunshot murder, but as a source of moral gossip. Crowds soon began to gather near the site at Ticknock. Locals, curious after reading the headlines, came to see where she had been found. The road became, for a time, a place of morbid fascination. For the police, this posed its own problem, controlling onlookers while trying to carry out an investigation with limited resources. The discovery of Honor Bright's body at Ticknock was the turning point that transformed her death into one of Dublin's most talked about cases of the decade. With her identity confirmed and the cause of death established as the gunshot wound to her chest, the Gardaí now faced a murder investigation. For the public, the scandal lay not just in the violence of the crime, but in the fact that men of standing had been seen with her on the night she died. From this point forward, the question was not whether Honor Bright had been murdered, but who had killed her and whether justice would ever be done. Gardaí had launched a full investigation. I mean, for a woman to be shot dead and found on the roadside was shocking enough in itself. But the fact in those days that she'd been last seen in the company of two respected men, a doctor and a Dublin Metropolitan Police Constable, ensured the case drew immediate attention. The investigation began by retracing Lizzie's movements on the evening of the 8th of June 1925. Witnesses placed her in several licensed premises around Dublin. She'd been drinking heavily and was clearly unwell by the time she left the city. Multiple people confirmed seeing her with these two men. Bar staff described her as pale, unsteady and needing help to walk. Others noted the make and model of the motor car that they'd left in late that night. With these accounts in hand, the Gardaí moved quickly to question the doctor and the constable. Both admitted to being with Lizzie that evening. Neither denied that they had spent hours drinking together or that they had been in her company when they left the city. Their accounts, however, sought to distance themselves from her death. They insisted that they had left her alive and safe and that they had nothing to do with her shooting. From the start, the investigation faced obstacles. Forensic science in Ireland in the 1920s was rudimentary, to say the least. There was no ballistic analysis that could reliably tie a bullet to a particular firearm, and no method for lifting prints from the scene in a way that would stand up in court. Investigators had a cause of death, a clear timeline, and 2 suspects, but little in the way of physical evidence. The Gardaí did, however, gather testimony that undermined the men's claims. Several witnesses placed Lizzie as drunk and vulnerable, relying on the men to guide her. A lodging house friend confirmed that she had not returned that night, meaning she died between the time she'd left the city with them and the morning when her body was found. The gap in their story was obvious. They were the last known people to have been seen with her alive, yet she ended up shot on Ticknock Road. At the inquest, details of the post-mortem were shared publicly. The coroner confirmed a single fatal gunshot wound. There was no evidence of self-inflicted injury, no indication that Lizzie had had a weapon herself, and no suggestion of accidental discharge. The coroner's findings reinforced what the Gardaí already believed. This was murder. The press followed each development closely. Newspapers reported on the statements being taken and the questioning of the 2 men. But much of the coverage remained focused on Honor's reputation rather than the investigation itself. She was repeatedly described as a prostitute, her lifestyle used as a lens through which the case was interpreted. By contrast, the doctor and the policeman were referred to in terms of their positions, their respectability emphasised, even as they were being questioned in connection with a homicide. This double standard did not go unnoticed, especially among Dubliners. There was talk of injustice even before the case reached the courts. The feeling was that if the victim had been from a more respectable background, the tone of reporting and perhaps the urgency of the investigation might have been very different. Despite the limitations, Gardaí pressed on. Statements were taken not only from those who had seen the group drinking in the city, but also from people living near Ticknock who might have heard a gunshot. A few said they recalled a noise in the night, but none could pinpoint the time or provide detail that could link it directly to Honor's death. The lack of physical evidence meant the case rested heavily on circumstantial connections. The last sighting of Honor alive, the company she was keeping, the improbability of anyone else being involved in the narrow window between her leaving Dublin and her body being discovered. The Gardaí believed they had enough to bring charges, though. Both men were arrested and put forward for trial on charges of murder. The decision to proceed was a significant one. Charging a doctor and a serving constable with the killing of a young woman was always going to attract public scrutiny. For the Gardaí, it was a test of whether justice could be done when the accused held positions of respect and authority. For the press, it guaranteed weeks of headlines. By the end of June 1925, the investigation phase was effectively complete. The Gardaí had built their case as far as they could. Honor Bright had been last seen alive with these 2 men. She had been vulnerable and incapable of defending herself, and hours later she was found dead from that single gunshot wound. With the suspects in custody, attention now turned to the courts, where the evidence would be put to the test. The case was heard at the Dublin Circuit Criminal Court. Crowds gathered outside from the start, curious to catch sight of the accused and eager for updates. Inside, the public gallery was packed with journalists, relatives and members of the public. The newspapers gave the case front-page coverage day after day, sometimes filling whole columns with testimony. At the centre of it all was the victim, Elizabeth O'Neill, otherwise known as Honor Bright. Her funeral had taken place by then, but in the courtroom, her life and character were picked over in ways that reflected the prejudices of the time. The prosecution presented her as a vulnerable young woman, intoxicated and at the mercy of those she was with. The defence sought to cast doubt on her respectability and highlight her drinking and her reputation in the city. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the timeline. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing Honor drinking with the doctor and the constable on June the 8th. Bar staff described her as barely able to stand without support. Others recalled the three leaving together in that motorcar. She never returned home, and by morning, she was dead. The post-mortem evidence was straightforward. One fatal gunshot fired at close range. There was no suggestion she had inflicted it on herself, and the wound was not consistent with an accident. What the prosecution lacked, however, was a firearm. No gun was ever recovered, and no direct physical evidence tied either man to the fatal shot. Of course, the defence seized on this gap. They argued that while the men had been with her earlier in the night, there was no proof they had been with her when she died. They suggested that Honor may have encountered others later, though they offered no clear explanation of how or with whom. Their strategy, of course, was to cast doubt, not to prove innocence, but show that guilt could not be established without reasonable doubt. As the trial unfolded, the newspapers reported every detail of the testimony, but rarely with sympathy for the victim. Honor was described as a woman of the streets, a notorious character, and her nickname Honor Bright was repeated with a sneer. Instead of focusing on her as a daughter, as a mother, the reporting highlighted her lifestyle. This framing fed directly into the defence's arguments, encouraging the jury to see her as unreliable and her death as somehow less shocking. The contrast with how the accused was described was stark. The doctor was referred to by his professional title. His background as a man of learning and respectability emphasised. The constable was described as a serving officer, a man trusted with public safety. The implication was clear. Respectable men should be given the benefit of the doubt, while a young woman like Honor should be judged harshly. When the time came, the jury deliberated on the evidence. They could not ignore the fact that Honor had been last seen alive with these two men. But they also had no gun, no eyewitness to the shooting, and no confession. The evidence was circumstantial, and the law required certainty. Both men were acquitted of murder. The verdict shocked many, though it did not surprise those who had watched how the case had been handled. For Lizzie's friends and family, it was devastating. Her death had been proven to be homicide, but no one was being held responsible. The acquittal was widely reported, with newspapers again focusing more on the reputations of the accused than on the young woman who had lost her life. Among Dubliners, the sense grew that the justice system had failed her. Conversations in lodging houses and pubs reflected a belief that if the victim had been from a different background, the outcome might have been very different. The trial closed officially with the release of the doctor and the constable, and the file on Honor Bright's death was left unresolved. Officially, her murder remains unsolved to this day. The cause of death was never disputed, but no one was ever held responsible. For her family in Carlow, her friends in the Liberties, and the young son she left behind, it was an unbearable outcome. With the verdict delivered, the case was struck off the court's lists. Newspapers, which had run daily columns on the trial, quickly turned to other stories. In her lodging house on Newmarket, her absence, obviously, was permanent. Her roommate, Bridie Hopkins, had given testimony at the inquest and watched the case play out, but in the end, the loss was personal. It was her friend. For Lizzie's parents, the ordeal was twofold. They had lost their daughter violently, and they'd watched her name being dragged through the newspapers as if she was on trial herself. Their grief was made heavier by the way she had been portrayed. Her son, Kevin Barry O'Neill, her only child, well, he grew up without his mother, his life shaped by her absence. Among ordinary Dubliners, the case left a sour taste. Many believed the justice system had failed. The view was simple. Had the victim come from a respectable family, the tone of the press and the outcome in court might have been very different. The handling of the case reinforced the perception that social position could protect the accused while condemning the victim. Over the decades, Lizzie's story moved into memory, basically. It was told in lodging houses, in local histories, and later revisited by writers who pointed out what it revealed about Irish society. Even cultural figures like W.B. Yeats remarked on the injustice, saying that her life had been dismissed too easily. In recent years, historians and journalists have revisited her case with a different focus. Instead of presenting her only as Honor Bright, they restore her full name, Elizabeth O'Neill, and place her back in her family and in her community. She was a daughter, she was a sister, and she was a mother. And she deserved the same protection and dignity as any other citizen. One visible act of remembrance came in the form of that plaque on Ticknock Road, close to where her body was found, that simply reads, Honor Bright, 9th of June 1925, rest in peace. That's the only detail that's on it. Doesn't mention the trial or the men who walked free. It just fixes her name and the date, offering her just a modicum of dignity that she was denied in life and in the courtroom. Now, in 2025, it is a full century since her death. The murder of Elizabeth O'Neill remains unsolved. What has changed is how she's remembered. In 1925, the press judged her more than they mourned her. Today, she's recognised as a young woman who was denied justice. Her story endures not because of scandal, but because it shows how Ireland treated women on the margins and how easily their lives could be dismissed. The plaque at Ticknock Road is small, but it says enough. It is a quiet acknowledgement that she once lived, that her life was taken violently, and that even though her alleged killers may have escaped justice, her story has not been forgotten. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries, and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.